If you're a startup founder, or even if you work at a startup, congratulations. You're a professional athlete in the team sport known as commercial knowledge work, where teams of humans try to make money using their brains through business ventures. And not only is this a team sport, you're actually in a league with all the other teams or companies because everyone's competing for the same talent pool. However, the nature of this talent pool is not well understood by founders nor by many of the participants themselves. I had originally written an episode introducing the single most powerful mental model I know about talent strategy called the talent gradient, but it got so long that it became unwieldy. The problem was that I kept needing to assume that the audience already understood how to see cognitive ability in someone, which is a very rare skill these days. In fact, it took me nearly a decade of interviewing thousands of people, making hundreds of hires, and then observing their trajectories in a complex knowledge work environment in order to undo years of misguided beliefs. But I hope to save you all that time and effort with a few shortcuts I distilled. So let's begin. Hello, fellow founders. Welcome to Startup Gospel, where there's always good news for your startup, and maybe your soul too. But this is a startup-themed episode, which means I am here and only here to transmit to you a lattice of mental models that will change how you see the world and make success inevitable. Today, we're going to talk about something called G-factor, its properties, and its underlying distribution. Now, a word of warning. Like all powerful and highly explanatory mental models that change how you see the world forever, this is probably not going to give you the warm fuzzies. In fact, it's probably going to feel like staring into the abyss for a little while. And in my case, I was actually pretty despondent for a few months as I contemplated the societal implications of all this. So if the time isn't right, or you don't have the space in your life right now for the topic of differences in intellectual ability, I'd recommend coming back to this video at a later time. So with that warning out of the way, here's the map for our journey today. Okay, let's start here. So the hardest part of talking about cognitive ability is that you can't physically see it. So my idea here is to use height as a physical analog, which is a very visible human trait that everyone is familiar with. And more importantly, everyone has already had to face a level of inequality about it they can't really control. So we're somehow more okay with sayings like, you can't coach height. Believe me, I tried. So here's what the distribution of human height around the world looks like. You'll see that men and women each sit in their own normal distributions. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to simplify this to one distribution and just refer to men's heights because the standard deviation is a little higher, so it's easier to visualize jumps in standard deviations, especially as we go 3, 4, 5 sigma out. The next thing I'll note is that human traits tend to be distributed normally. I won't get into the reasons for this, but the intuition is basically the central limit theorem, which is a statistical principle that says that when a trait is the result of many independent factors, both genetic and environmental as in this case, the resulting distribution for that trait tends to be normally distributed. The thing I really want us to build an intuition for, though, is the rarity of a trait at various standard deviations. For example, how many men would you have to assemble at random in the world before you were likely to see a 7-footer for the first time? The answer is about 150,000. How did I get that number? Let's look at the chart again. Thanks to the normal distribution, we actually only need to know what one standard deviation for height is, and by this study, it's about 3 inches. So that implies that a 7-footer is about at the 99.999th percentile of the male human population, given that it's a 4.5 standard deviations away from the mean. And thanks to the normal distribution, we can just look up in a table how rare that is. In fact, here's a table we can construct combining both the chart and the values predicted by the normal distribution. While the goal here is to familiarize ourselves with the implied rarity at various standard deviations, I also want to emphasize another observation, which is that these percentiles can sound pretty intimidating out of context. For example, how would you feel saying that you're 99th percentile at something? It's usually not the kind of thing that you would utter at a dinner party, for example. Well, definitionally, that's the same thing as saying that you're the best out of 100 randomly selected people for whatever that thing is. Let's say photographing seals. To be 95th percentile, you just have to be the best out of 20 randomly selected people. It's actually not as hard as it sounds, especially in very niche things. I don't actually have a hobby of photographing seals. I just found a random picture in my photos. I don't know about you, but when I first started internalizing that, I realized how distorted my sense of percentiles were. So I hope what this analogy with height should help us realize is that A, it is simultaneously very impressive to be 6'4" or taller. We definitely notice when someone is of that height. And B, statistically speaking, we all know a guy who's 6'4" or maybe even several. It is, after all, only 1 out of 22 in the population at large. But notice also how quickly the odds change as we move out on the distribution. For example, to find someone who's 7'2" or taller, just 10 inches taller, we're looking for the 99.9999th percentile man all of a sudden, which means about 1 in 1.7 million, which is like the entire size of the Stockholm metro area. Now, all of a sudden, we can likely only think of NBA players or someone on TV that we've seen because on average, We do not personally know 1.7 million people. Additionally, the Stockholm example is also great because it reminds us that in reality, no place is completely randomly distributed. In fact, Stockholm's not a bad bet if you wanted to find a disproportionate number of 7-footers, whether men or women. I've definitely seen my share of them around the city. Where I think I have, I'm just looking from a very low angle and it's hard to tell past a certain point. Okay, last step. What I want you to do now is to look at these rarities and come up with personal mnemonics you can use in your head to visualize the rarity. For example, 95th percentile is equivalent to 1 out of 20, which is like the best person out of a typical classroom. 99.7th percentile, or 1 in 370, is like the best person out of a high school class all sitting in the same auditorium. 99.99th percentile, or 1 in 15,787, is like being the best out of everyone in an NBA stadium. 99.9999th percentile, or 1 in 1.7 million, is like being the best out of everyone in a Tier 2 US city metro area, slightly smaller than a Portland, Oregon, or Nashville, Tennessee metro area, for example, or Stockholm if you're European. If you're in China, I'm sorry, this is like the number of people inside a train car or something. But you get the idea. Find some real-world examples that can help you visualize the degree of rarity more easily. That's going to make it easier to reason about percentiles. Now, one last thing before we move on. On the topic of the NBA, most players are actually clustered in the 6'4 to 6'9 range. So professional basketball can be said to be a 2 to 3.5 sigma height sport. That's actually important because the data is telling us that the absolute best people in the world at this particular thing, where height is such an obvious advantage, is not solely predicated on height. This is somewhat surprising because A, from first principles, more height is clearly more helpful, and B, in theory, there are more than enough grown men over 7'2" who could fill the 450 roster spots in the NBA, yet why isn't that the case? Intuitively, this can only be true if there are other traits that also matter on the margins, even though being in the 95th percentile of height is clearly very helpful according to the data. Keep this in mind as we go on to the next section about intelligence. Speaking of which, let's talk about G-factor. So imagine you have people do a bunch of cognitive tests. Well, it turns out that doing well on any one cognitive test is strongly correlated with doing well on all of them. And a cognitive test can be something as trivial as count the number of F's in this paragraph, or identify the next pattern in the sequence, to what musical interval are these notes? Yes, that's right. If you're better at the first, meaning you can do it more accurately and in less time, you're likely to be better at the second and the third as well. And so when you control for the task-specific ability that someone has, perhaps someone's more trained in music, for example, and you look at what's left over, that unmeasurable yet very real thing that carries over from one cognitive endeavor into all other cognitive endeavors for any one given individual, that's called the G-factor. Did you know you could increase your G-factor by putting shades on? That's right, you don't get this kind of information anywhere else.
Like and subscribe, Holmes.
Okay, you're probably thinking at this point, how is this different than IQ? Because it sure sounds like IQ to me. Well, not so fast. The idea of the G-factor is ultimately a theoretical concept. Its existence is inferred from looking at the data and reasoning from first principles, not dissimilar to how we infer the existence of black holes, for example. It's not like we can see black holes. It's kind of in the name that we can't see them directly.
Now we can.
But we can still deduce that something with a specific set of properties, conceptually called a black hole, could exist as the simplest explanation of the data, and so it is for G-factor. IQ, on the other hand, is an attempt at measuring intelligence quantitatively and normalizing the scores on a bell curve. It's trying to be the measuring tape for intelligence, so to speak. Now, for sure, G-factor and IQ are going to be correlated. In fact, G-factor proponents would argue, what is an IQ test but another variant of a cognitive test, like counting the number of F's in a paragraph? And so, of course, a higher G-factor would result in a higher IQ score, given all the other correlations we can measure. And I would agree with that, even to the point where I think it's a useful, albeit imprecise, shortcut to use IQ as a proxy for G-factor. For example, it's probably true that G-factor is normally distributed just like IQ, similar to height, which is the primary assumption of this episode. And while our society has no problem talking about differences in height and even venerating those at the upper percentiles of the bell curve, it's all I ever wanted. G-factor doesn't get the same treatment, or at least not overtly. But just like how height in men seems to have broad positive impact on their economic outcomes, so does IQ to an even greater extent, but for everyone. So let's actually line the two up in the table we had before. I'm going to use the 15-point standard deviation model for IQ for simplicity. So Einstein, whose IQ was rumored to be at or over 160, was basically a mental 7-footer. But even so, the implied rarity is something like being the best out of an NBA-sized stadium of randomly selected people, which again isn't that rare when you stop and think about it. In fact, there are a lot of Einstein-level IQs floating around, maybe about 500,000 in the world right now, and perhaps half of them are of working age. But we're not getting 250,000 theories of relativity. So again, we keep coming back to this analogous idea that height or intellect alone, while extremely helpful, doesn't fully explain any one particular outlier. But hey, it's not like you're a slouch at the third standard deviation or anything. In fact, if you're clocking a 145 IQ, you've probably been called a genius or something similar when you were growing up, especially because you are being observed in the context of a single classroom, which is a 1 out of 20 setting. When in fact, the implied rarity is really that you'd still be exceptional even when compared to the entire year, which is a 1 out of 370 setting or thereabouts. And just for completeness, at the second standard deviation, about 125 IQ or 95th percentile, it sounds impressive, but we all know a bunch of guys who are at the corresponding level of rarity for height, which would be 6'4". Like, it's really not that rare, which isn't to take anything away from how desirable it is. I would love to be 6'4", for example. It's all I ever wanted. But definitionally speaking, if you have an average high school class, this is like the top 5% of the class. However, caveat once again, if you went to a quote good school district where smart parents who value an education for their kids tend to congregate, this IQ level could be prevalent in as high as 30 to 40% of the school or more. In any case, the implied rarity here of 5% is that there's about 400 million people at this IQ level around the world. If we ask what the number of white-collar professionals around the world is, we get estimates of around 20% of the working population, or about 7 to 800 million people. If we assume that these 7 to 800 million are the more cognitively able ones, a big if you ask me, but just humor me for a second, then the lived experience for any white-collar workers should be that a third of the white-collar professionals they run into have IQs higher than the 95th percentile of the overall population, and I'll show the napkin math over here. Okay, now that we have the theory, let's make it practical by seeing how we can apply it in the real world. The first puzzle we have to solve is how can we get better at spotting high G factor assuming there is no perfectly accurate measuring tape? Well, one idea we've been building towards in this video is that we might be able to reason by analogy through height. So suppose you have to devise a series of tests to identify a 7-footer, but you couldn't see them or measure their height. What might you do instead? An obvious idea might be to put them in a controlled empty room where there is a shelf that's say 9 feet high with an object on it, and nothing else in the room. They must then clear the shelf somehow and leave the room. You can then go into the room afterwards and see if the shelf still has anything left on it. If it's empty, you might conclude that yes, indeed, a 7-footer has come through the room. However, this isn't foolproof because someone who's 6'4" can presumably just jump and remove the object. Heck, even someone who's 5'8" with a great vertical could remove the object. Muggsy Bogues was famously 5'3" and could dunk, so maybe this test isn't so good after all. No problem, you say. Let's add many objects to the shelf then and put a time limit. Even if they have to jump, they can only remove 1 or 2 items at a time, whereas a 7-footer should be able to just pick them off quickly and effortlessly. Yes, this would be a good improvement. In fact, this is pretty analogous to a well-designed case question where it's just you and the interviewer in the room, and they want to see how much you can take off the shelf in the allotted time. Can you do it effortlessly, or are you jumping a few times? And if you have to jump, how efficient are your mechanics? The harder and more complex the case problem, the higher up the proverbial shelf. Maybe it's so high up that even the 7-footer has to jump a little. Another idea is to look at what pre-selected population someone came from. For example, if you couldn't see the subject but you knew for sure that they were a former NBA player, your prior probability that they're over 7 feet tall goes from the population rarity of 0.01% to about 10%, so about 1,000 times more likely. Even without requiring a test like removing something from a tall shelf, you could just tick yes and likely be right at least 1 out of 10 times. In knowledge work, this is why companies sometimes use credential filters like the school you went to or the programs you were accepted to or awards you got, and then vibe hire based on that. I'm not saying it's effective, but the Bayesian logic would be sound at least. And even if you don't get a 7-footer, you'll on average get someone who's 6'4" or taller, like in the NBA example. However, this only works to the extent those previous organizations were actually selecting for the thing the company claims to be looking for. In our example, if the NBA started a side mission of making sure short people were properly represented in professional basketball as of, say, the draft class of 2020, then you need to start taking into account what year an NBA player joined the league before vibe hiring based on credentials alone, right? Lastly, you could use the idea that height is genetic and ask about the person's parents or siblings. If I knew that the test subject's parents were both over 6'5" and there was a sibling who I can observe to definitely be a 7-footer, then that greatly increases my confidence that the test subject, who I'm not allowed to see or measure, could also be a 7-footer. Won't be the case 100% of the time, but the odds are certainly in my favor. So those are just some examples of how we can use height to reason by analogy for something we can't see or measure quite as easily. But like I said before, this is just laying the theoretical foundations for many more episodes to come, so don't worry. We will get to the practical applications in short order. Finally, to close, let's zoom out and remember why we're having this discussion in the first place. My claim at the start was that you're a player in a professional team sport known as commercial knowledge work. And as startup founders, we are simultaneously the team captains playing on the field, as well as the front office executives who have to build the team. The main trait that determines success in our field of work, general mental ability or G factor, is not something that can be observed at first sight. And as a result, most of us don't have good intuitions about it, even though we can clearly see the impact of intelligence over time. So the goal of this episode was to use height, another normally distributed trait in the human population, to reason by analogy and see if we could sharpen our intuition a little bit about G factor. So I hope this video has given you some inspiration for how to do that. Now, remember what I said about professional basketball being a 2 to 3.5 sigma height sport? That's worth emphasizing again here because it's really important that we understand what a team sport is and what effect that has on any one sought after trait. Like if basketball were a single player sport where the goal was just to put the ball through a 10-foot hoop as many times as possible in a given time period, then yeah, I'd expect height to be the dominant factor by far. The strategy would clearly be to reach taller than the hoop and then pass the ball through as many times as possible in quick succession. But as soon as you mix in a team dynamic, the weaknesses and trade-offs of being singularly tall can be exploited. For example, taller people tend to be slower on average since they have a greater moment of inertia. And then you get this game theoretic shakeout and eventually some kind of equilibrium emerges. On a modern basketball team, it usually helps to have one super tall guy simply for the advantage it affords, or maybe two at most in the proverbial twin tower arrangement. But the data suggests that there are diminishing returns and you need a complement of skills in a 5-man lineup. And so it is with knowledge work. Yes, there will be highly complex problems sitting on a proverbial high shelf where it really helps to have someone who can reach it with almost no effort. But there is so much more to a successful business team than being a towering intellect who can compress and distill a lot of complexity. As with professional basketball, I've observed that the best knowledge work teams are also in that 2 to 3.5 sigma range. So that tells us that there's many other factors besides maximum intellect that matter on the margins. Over the course of the next few videos, I'm going to be building towards a definition of talent that not only includes raw intellect, which of course it would have to, but which will also encompass everything else that a business requires of its team. And yes, there's a nicely distilled framework for that as well, so stay tuned for more. All right, I think that's a good place to call it for today. As always, when you find the success you've been looking for, just remember to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. All right, I'll see you in the next one. It's all I ever wanted.